Hey everyone, and welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. I hope you all are having a lovely Friday so far. Today, we are going to be discussing the plants and herbs of spring. We'll be going over a few different aspects of this. First, we'll be discussing how our pagan ancestors viewed the season of spring. Then I will be going over four different plants and herbs traditionally associated with this season among the witchy and pagan types. And we'll also be discussing some fun folklore and sayings associated with different plants during springtime. Then we're going to go over some big questions. So, what are some of the wider themes when it comes to us as modern witches and pagans approaching the spring planting season? And then finally, I'm going to be sharing with you what I will be planting this season, and I'm going to want to hear what you will be planting as well. So that is the agenda for today. And if you are new here, welcome. I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. And it's really just a great way for us fellow pagans and witches to connect, to chat, to share ideas, to have discussions. So I will be looking over here at the chat box as we do go along. I will try my best to bring in your thoughts and your questions into the conversation as much as possible. Now, there are two ways you can support Pagan Happy Hour if you do enjoy it. The first way is through my Patreon, which I do have linked down below. If you do choose to become a patron, you also gain access to my exclusive Discord community, which is a really fun group of fellow witches and pagans. So it's a great resource if you are looking for an online pagan community. And the second way you can support Pagan Happy Hour is through the Super Chats feature here on YouTube. It's a $ button at the bottom of the chat box. Through that, you can donate any amount, and your comment or question will pop up really big for me. So I'll be sure to bring in your thoughts into the conversation as well. Now, let me share with you what I am drinking, and why don't you share with me where you happen to be watching from and what you are drinking this evening. Let me cue that drink music. So I'm having a nice whiskey this evening. Let me see where you all are chiming in from tonight. So it looks like we have people watching from Missouri, from Denver, Kansas City, Arlington, Wisconsin, Vancouver, Belgium, Alabama, Indiana, New Hampshire, Germany, Illinois, England, the Bay Area, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, Germany. Let's see, we have Serbia, Vermont, Charlotte. We have Las Vegas, Asheville, Florida, New York, Mississippi, North Carolina, China, Chicago, Seattle, and Dallas. So thank you all so much for chiming in tonight. Thank you for sharing a bit of your Friday with me. And I hope you're feeling extra springy this week, because that is what we are going to be talking about. So let me have a sip of my whiskey and we will jump right into it. Okay. Let me turn off the music here. Though I feel bad turning off the music because I just kind of want to jam sometimes. But we must jump into it. So let's see. Okay. So first, let's talk a bit about spring in the context of our pagan ancestors. Now, we do know that there are many deities across multiple pagan cultures that are specifically associated with spring. You could think of the Roman goddess Flora, who is associated with flowers, or the Greek Persephone, who people celebrated this time of year as she would be returning from Hades and the underworld back onto our plane of earth. She was also a goddess of spring. So there are many different spring goddesses across cultures. A little bit earlier on, when we were celebrating Ostara, I was talking about the Germanic goddess of dawn and spring, Aostra. In the Norse pantheon, you could even think of Idun as a bit of a goddess of spring, or perhaps even Freya. So there are so many different spring deities. We know that among our pagan ancestors, they were, of course, very aware of the agricultural seasons, of the shifts in the wheel of the year. And there were many different deities that were specifically tied to the seasons. Now, another thing to keep in mind that while spring to us in our modern day context kind of seems really life giving and fertile and abundant, this was actually kind of the hungry gap times among our pagan ancestors. It is in early spring that people would be kind of running out of their winter stores. By this time, they would have been probably tired of potatoes or other root vegetables. They might have be running out of their grains. Most of their fresh vegetables would have rotted by now or been eaten. So even though nowadays we think of spring as so lush and vibrant, this was actually kind of a tough time for our early pagan ancestors because there wasn't that much growing that you could actually eat in early spring. Though there were some items, some plants and herbs, which we're going to get into. But overall, this was a time where people were kind of probably a bit on edge, really hungry, really looking forward to the next harvest. But the next harvest would be not till, a few months away. When we look at the traditional wheel of the year, we have three harvest festivals. So we have Lunasad, we have Mabon or the autumn equinox, and we have Samhain. So that's obviously not happening until late summer. Though, of course, there would be some things growing in early spring to midsummer. But in general, this time in early spring was kind of considered to be that hunger gap. So, next, we're going to look at a few kind of traditional herbs and plants that our ancestors were looking out for, that they would be trying to find in the wilderness. But before we get to that, let me check your comments and see if you have anything to mention about, kind of our pagan ancestors' perception of spring. Oh, a good comment here from Sarah T that says, it's interesting how many early spring herbs are good for getting your lymphatic system going and your vitamin C. Yes, exactly. Because, at this time of year, your vitamin C was probably pretty depleted. So it would be important to forage, to grow what you could to replenish that. And I see Lorem Ipsum in the comments mentioning that it sounds like Lunasad was underrated. Yeah, it kind of is an underrated pagan holiday. Traditionally, we associate it with bread and baking and the grain harvest, which for us doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you consider our ancestors and the vast majority of their calories coming from carbohydrates, it was a big deal to reach that time of the grain harvest. Let's see. So let's talk a bit about a few different kind of traditional plants and herbs that people would be looking for in early spring. Now, this is going to be different for every culture, every area around the world. So it's really difficult to talk about spring plants and herbs because there is so much variation. So for today, I'm mostly focusing on British or Celtic spring plants and herbs because that's where the vast majority of the folklore that we have about witchy plants and herbs comes from. A lot of what we associate with the historical witch is coming from a British context. So we're looking at a time period that is post Christianization of Britain, but still a time where people were foraging, were growing herbs. And this is where you kind of get a lot of the concepts, imagery, folklore around the traditional witch that lives, at the edge of the village. She's an herbalist, she's growing things, medicinal, edible. So a lot of our perceptions of the modern witch are coming from Britain in the early modern era. Um, but the first one I wanted to talk about is a plant called Good King Henry, which you might not be aware of. And for today, wanted to pick a few things that you might have not heard of before. And this plant was interestingly also called Mercury. Of course, after the Roman god Mercury, or the Greek equivalent Hermes. And this was one of the favorite leafy greens that you could grow and harvest in early spring. It was kind of akin to spinach. It was the most popular leafy green, basically until spinach arrived. Spinach didn't arrive in Britain until a little bit later. So this was the main kind of leafy green of early spring. And it tasted and functioned pretty much similar to spinach, and that you could eat it in a salad, you could like saute it. It had a lot of iron, a lot of really good nutrients. And it's said that Saint Henry used this herb, or the plant called Good King Henry, hence the name, and he made a healing poultice out of it. So that's where that name comes from. It's not from Henry VIII or anything like that. It's from Saint Henry. Though there are multiple Saint Henrys, and no one's sure which saint this is named after. But we do know that this plant was used by the pagans before Christianization. This was a really important plant for the Celts, for the British pagans, and it was only much later that Saint Henry name was attached to it, and it was renamed Good King Henry. So I wanted to mention that herb because it's something you might not have heard of before, but it definitely has a rich history in both pagan times and after the Christianization as one of the most nutrient dense and important plants of early spring. Oh, I see some of you guys are listing some good comments. Let me see what you all have to say. Okay. Oh, Phoenix has a interesting comment that says, I noticed that different areas of the world celebrate the return of Persephone depending on when you see spring actually returning, as in Ostara or Beltane. Right now, we are in that kind of in-between time. And I tend to think of the pagan holidays less as a specific day and more of a specific season. So I look at the time right now as we are slowly leaving Ostara season and entering Beltane season, since we're kind of about at that halfway point before reaching Beltane. So Beltane is kind of the ultimate spring fertility season, whereas Ostara is just the first inklings of spring. Though, of course, this is going to change depending on what area of the country you live in. Since I now live in the American South, my version of Ostara and Beltane is probably going to look a little bit different than yours would if you live in a more northern climate. And of course, if you live in the southern hemisphere, everything's kind of switched up. Let me see what else you guys have to say. Let's see. Oh, Lynn Smith has a good point. She says many plants that can't be eaten later are good now in early spring, such as hostas and dandelion, as well as violets. Um, yeah, and dandelions are actually the next plant I wanted to cover. So, dandelions have been used for both medicinal and culinary purposes around the world for basically millennia. We do know that some of the first written accounts of the use of dandelion is actually from the Chinese, and then it shifts into Arabic cultures, where they were sharing kind of the use of dandelion to treat certain liver and kidney issues. But before them, the Chinese knew that dandelion could help with the immune system in general. And then eventually, all of Europe became well aware of the dandelion and were either using it in their kitchen or in their medicinal cabinet. So, dandelion as a whole has kind of been around the entirety of the planet and has been used by countless pagan and Christian cultures. Oh, we have our first super chat from Daka. Thank you so much. That says, this week, Slavs celebrate Flower Week. This is also the day when herbalists would gather plants. Also, the day of the willow is observed when we welcome spring. Oh, that's super interesting. And it's neat thinking about this week in particular, which is something I was going to get to later, but I might as well mention now. So, this is Easter weekend, right? We probably all know this. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, you've probably seen some of my content where I talk about how much of the Easter traditions and symbolism actually derives from earlier Ostara traditions. But as we look at the world from a post Christian time scale, so after the conversion in Europe, Easter was the time when historical witches and the ordinary folk would be doing the most planting. And this is actually still seen today. You'll find that the most busiest time for garden centers and nurseries is actually Easter weekend. There is some folklore around this as well. It's believed that Good Friday was, in particular, a very auspicious day to do some planting. It was believed so because the devil was considered powerless on Good Friday. So, even though that's a Christian superstition, it kind of rings a little witchy too, I think. And also, if you were to plant what were called Ghillie flowers, these would be plants such as carnations or dianthus. If you planted them at noon on Good Friday, so you've already missed it if you happen to be in America. But it was believed that they would miraculously bear double blooms. So, next Good Friday at noon, I recommend planting some dianthus and carnations. And even though this is a Christian piece of folklore, it's likely it does derive maybe a little bit earlier, or a lot of these pagan traditions kind of did merge into these Christian traditions. So it's likely it might have some older origins as well. So, another thing I wanted to mention, kind of going back to dandelions, a few other kind of neat witchy facts about them. One of the terms is fairy clocks for dandelions because they open and close at very regular times in the morning and the evening. So if you're feeling extra witchy, you can refer to the dandelions in your yard as fairy clocks. And dandelions were also traditionally used as a tool for divination. So this is after they have turned into their seed head. And if you were to blow on the dandelion seed head, and then you look at how many bits of seeds are remaining, that traditionally was how many children you would have. As we look at spring divinatory traditions, and you especially see this in Beltane, this was a time of year that so much divination, such as apple divination, is another one that you might see during Beltane, or even kind of around the Beltane fire pit. A lot of it is often connected to relationships, marriage, children, that kind of stuff. So, if you do have any divination you want to do associated with relationships, marriage, all of that kind of stuff, this time of spring is the moment to do that type of stuff and is actually very historically accurate to when these things be occurring. Um, Oh, I see some of you guys commenting about dandelions. Jenna is mentioning that they usually pop up for her right around Beltane. Yeah, so it is a bit different depending on your climate. Um, let's see. Emily is mentioning that she noticed the first dandelions of the season today. That's wonderful. And I see someone in Pennsylvania noticing dandelions popping up as well. Um, so yeah, there is so much you can do with dandelions. Another neat piece of folklore is that the dandelion in Victorian flower language was considered to be a flower of love, which is pretty wonderful considering the dandelion is kind of a modest flower, and many people, in fact, consider it a weed. But in Victorian times, it would have been this symbol of love to give someone a dandelion, which I think is so precious and cute. And another thing with the dandelions is because they have that bright yellow color, they are also associated with the sun, and as such, associated with any solar deities. Aries, it could be Ra, any type of sun deity, it could be Lu. So, if you are trying to work with any deities that are associated with the sun, a little dandelion bouquet on your altar might be perfect for that. I do see some of you guys mentioning in the comments that it is kind of tricky to work with dandelions out, in kind of a foraging context because so many of them are sprayed with pesticides or tried to be killed, since they're considered weeds. And you do have to be careful with that. So I'm glad you guys brought that up. You don't want to just be pulling dandelions in your local park and then using them in either a witchy or a culinary context, because likely they've been poisoned at that point by whatever they're spraying on the fields. So it's best to forage for them in your own yard where you know what you're putting on your lawn. So make sure you are careful with that. So we went over Good King Henry, we went over dandelions, two more to go. The next one I wanted to mention is chickweed, which is a really popular plant associated with early spring. You've probably seen it around. There are over 25 species of it growing in North America. Its name coming from the fact that, chicks, so birds or, young chickens, any type of chicken really loves to eat chickweed. It's, really popular plant to eat for chickens. And of course, this is the time when the chickens would start laying their eggs again, too. So, as we think about nourishing ourselves, we can also think about nourishing the animals that sustain us in early spring, because it would have been a really big deal when the hens would start laying again. Now, chickweed does have some other uses. It has been traditionally prepared as an early spring tonic. It would be eaten either fresh or steamed, and it was believed that it cleansed the liver and the kidney. One English physician back in the day described chickweed as a fine, pleasing herb that was under the dominion of the moon. Because, of course, a lot of early folklore about herbs associates a planetary context, or one of the traditional seven spheres, seven heavenly spheres, to the different herbs. So, as we mentioned, dandelions being associated with the sun, your chickweed is kind of associated with the moon. So if you want a nice kind of solar lunar balance going on your altar, you might make yourself a little bouquet of dandelion and chickweed to get that balanced. Let me see here. Just checking your comments before we move on. Oh, and I did want to mention I have some links down below about herbalism in general. So if it is something you're wanting to learn more about, I listed a bunch of books, and I also listed a bunch of YouTube channels that I really enjoy for information on herbs and gardening in general. So the last herb that I wanted to discuss before we move on to a few other related topics is purple dead nettle. Now, the name is kind of a misnomer because it's not dead, it's very much alive here in early spring, which is why we're talking about it. This is one of the first spring plants to pop up, so you've probably seen it around. It's part of the mint family, and both the leaves and the flowers can be eaten. Now, purple dead nettle is interesting because it's definitely historically been used in a lot of magical contexts as well. In general, it tends to be associated with happiness and cheerfulness, which is important for any of us who might be recovering from what's that seasonal affective disorder, which I don't have anymore now that I live in Georgia. But back when I lived in Chicago for those 6-7 years, I definitely had. So, purple dead nettle is known to help in a witchy context to kind of bring in that happiness and that cheerfulness and to kind of shoo away that seasonal affective disorder. Now, since it can grow just about anywhere, even if the soil is kind of a poor quality, it does also kind of have some associations with tenacity or determination. So it could be used in a spell work to kind of imbue your life with a bit more tenacity. And also, its flowers and leaves, if they are dried, traditionally they have been used for kind of creating a loose incense. Again, the purpose of which to kind of lift your spirits, to bring a bit of that happiness and cheer into your life. So I wanted to share those four plants today. Of course, there are a multitude of early spring plants to discuss. I wanted to go with a few you might have heard of and a few you probably haven't, and also to have, a discussion a bit about the folklore behind those plants. But next, we're going to dive into a few kind of witchy superstitions and sayings around this spring planting season. But let me see what you guys have to say. Oh, I see Kiwi here in the comments asking if you can make lilac tea. Lilac is definitely another early spring herb or plant. And yes, I do believe you can make lilac tea. Let's see. I see Uhtred mentioning that today's topic seems kind of regional. Yes, and that is something I struggled with in this topic today because it is so regional. Because those of you on the southern hemisphere, you guys are moving towards autumn, so everything I'm saying today isn't of use for you right now, but it is something you can consider till when you eventually transition into the spring season several months down the road. But yes, and that is something to keep in mind when we are talking about quote unquote witchy herbs. What are we really talking about? Because there have been witches across all different cultures and time periods. Uh, but for now, and for the purposes of this pagan happy hour, I'm just kind of focusing in on British traditional plant lore and witchcraft because that is kind of the most common form of kind of our modern views of witchery, but there is so much complexity there and so much that does change based on your local region. Um, so next I wanted to just share a few little witchy sayings and superstitions around planting because I find this interesting. So a cold snap, which is something very common at this time of year, was traditionally called a Blackthorne Winter. So, a Blackthorne Winter because the frost could suddenly arrive after the blackthorn tree had blossomed. Now, while it was, probably a bad thing, it could damage your seedlings, it was considered to herald a good growing season overall. So if you do happen to have a last minute cold snap where you live, you can call it a Blackthorn Winter if you want to be consistent and witchy-ish or kind of witchy with your sayings there. There is another saying too for late snow that early witches used, which is onion snow. And this also was kind of considered to be a good thing, specifically for the allium family, which is the family of vegetables that onions are in, along with scallions and things like that. So you have onion snow and blackthorn winter as terms. Now, another kind of fun little tidbit is that in Britain, some gardeners would use birds to decide the best time to plant. So I like this kind of fact. It seems very witchy to me. So traditionally, the wagtail bird, when you would see that, that bird was known as the potato setter or the potato dropper. So at the first sight of the wagtail bird, that is when traditionally you would plant your potatoes. And then in Scotland, the first swallow sighting was the indicator to go ahead and get sowing. So the looking towards the birds for almost a divinatory context, I think is interesting because that's something you very much see in early pagan societies. People really did look to the skies, looked at the movement of the birds, and such movement could indicate a variety of things. Of course, we have multitudes of examples in the Greco-Roman world of birds indicating success or failure in battle. But here in these two examples, this is in the British context, birds representing times to plant and sow. If you do want to kind of learn more about the traditional folkloric indicators of planting and harvesting here in America, I recommend getting a copy of the Farmer's Almanac, which is kind of an old-fashioned publication, but it actually has a lot of wisdom passed down and a lot of neat kind of folkloric tidbits there. So let me check your comments here before we move on to some bigger questions associated with the spring season. Uhtred is mentioning usually cold snaps are bad for plants as it kills off the buds and you get less flowers overall. Yeah, that's true. Usually cold snaps are bad. So I don't know where that folklore comes from exactly about the Blackthorn Winter, but I do find it interesting. Oh, we have a super chat from Daka. Thank you very much. That says, let's not forget the storks. The village without them would have bad luck in the upcoming year. There's also the saying, one swallow doesn't bring spring. Yes, you should tell that to the Scots who might be planning their spring planting entirely based on when the swallows return. So yeah, thank you so much for the super chat and for sharing that. I see in the comments Leah mentioning that geese migrating is kind of her first sign of this seasonal transfer, this seasonal transition. Let's see. Great comments, guys. Thank you so much. So next I wanted to kind of discuss some of the bigger issues here, because when we think about the historical witch or even the pagan, we know that use and knowledge of plants and herbs were key, were essential, both to life, to surviving, but also in a spiritual context as well. So, kind of thinking then about how are herbs and plants fitting into our modern witchcraft or pagan practice that is often so much dominated in a intellectual way through reading books, and then also in a digital way through sharing via social media or YouTube or things like that. Our approach to witchcraft and paganism is quite a bit different in so many ways. But this kind of removal from the land is probably one of the most significant ways that our paganism or witchcraft differs from the historical version. Nowadays, you even have subsets of witchcraft. And, you might be considered a green witch, someone who works with plants and herbs. And that would be kind of 90%, 99% of any historical witch or pagan would also be doing that as well, or would be relying on someone in their community who did that. So it's kind of interesting that now we just kind of consider that a subset. So you could be a green witch, or you could be a cosmic witch, or a digital witch, or a chaos witch, or a sigil witch. But when we look historically, the use and knowledge of these plants and herbs would have actually been the cornerstone of a practice. And all spells, rituals, altars, etc., would be innately tied to the natural world, harvesting what was currently growing, sowing seeds, building your garden. So it is quite a bit different. I'm not necessarily saying that the historical version is better than the modern version. Obviously, the historical witch might envy us modern versions. We're, of course, not fighting for our lives here. But I do think it is something to consider as we approach our modern witchy and pagan practices, and thinking about how far removed we are from this agricultural cycle, from the knowledge and use of these plants and herbs. I mean, even for me, I've been following a pagan path since I was, a young teenager. And it's only over the past couple of years that I've even started to grow my own vegetables. So, I think there is such a disconnect in modern day society that I wonder what our role is as modern day pagans and witches to kind of approach the natural world. What is our role here when it comes to building our knowledge base and use of these historic plants and herbs? Let me know what you guys have to say about that, because I find that very interesting. Over the years, there's been many criticisms of the quote, living room witch, who doesn't get outside, who doesn't work with the land. What do you guys have to say about that? Let's see. Oh, Grace has an interesting comment that says a lot of the herbalism for us is symbolic as opposed to the ancient witches. Yeah, I think that's true too. The sense of kind of a literal belief in a certain herb doing something versus kind of a symbolic belief. There's a lot more flexibility there for us in modern day times. Daka says a big part of all our paths is environmentalism and community. There is no witch without her community. That's an interesting point. And, that brings up another great question here. What is the role of the modern witch when it comes to topics like environmentalism and conserving the land? Do we have a part that we need to play, a part that we could play, or does it not matter as much? So that's another great question to bring up. What is our role in the wider society? If we're looking at the historical witch who lived on kind of the outskirts of the village, kind of in a hut in the woods, she would not have had much political power and would not have necessarily been involved in the wider society as a whole. But that doesn't mean us modern witches need to do that necessarily, that we don't need to isolate ourselves and live on the outskirts of society. We do have more flexibility there. But what is our ultimate responsibility? So these are some kind of bigger issues that I often think about. So even when we're reflecting on the spring season, as we are growing, as we are setting the seeds and sowing, what is our ultimate responsibility here as the modern versions of pagans and witches? Let me see what else you guys have to say. Emily is mentioning, I think nature is essential for pagans and everyone else. Yes, I also agree there. I think there's even been a lot of scientific research lately that indicates that those that don't spend a lot of time in nature are more prone to both physical issues and mental issues. So, being in the natural world, surrounding ourselves with plants and herbs can be beneficial in so many different ways. Let's see. Drakara says that observing and respecting the seasonal cycle is an ever-growing part of my practice. I try to keep only seasonal herbs and offerings on my altar. And every year I am cooking more and more seasonally. Thank you for that comment. And me too. That really is what I strive for. Right now, I have a bunch of just kind of wildflowers that I've picked, some coming from my garden, some just kind of around the city for my fireplace altar setup there. And I really do try to constantly kind of change my altar up based on what's seasonal. What can I actually find in my area? Leah is mentioning that we should advocate and educate for the earth, going outside when we can, and having herbs in the home, even if it's a small amount. Yeah, I think that's a good point there, and that's a good goal to strive for. Um, let's see, what else do we have to say? Emmy is mentioning that as a modern witch, personally, she feels like it's our job to join the water protectors and be the voice of the land. Great question and great comment. Is it our responsibility to be the voice of the land? I tend to be a bit of an animist, so I do look at our Mother Earth or Gaia as a deity, as a significant spiritual presence. So, yes, in a certain context, I do think it is my personal responsibility to do what I can. But I also can recognize the historical aspect or the historical role of the witch, which was not necessarily to be in modern day society or to be part of the zeitgeist or the politics, but instead was to be a refuge for those that needed her or him, to be someone who lived outside of the norm, to be the outsider, to not be afraid to be unusual, and as such, to not necessarily be the spokesperson for whatever the latest thing was. So I kind of see both sides of it. What is the role of the modern witch if we're looking at it from a historical context? It's very confusing. I see both sides, and I think there's value in both. Um, let's see. In the comments, Hero says that plants have healing powers and knowledge that can be used to help change the world. Yeah, I think so too. I love educating. I love learning. So I do hope that through this platform, through the internet, I can share a love of plants, of herbs with others to hopefully do my own little small part in encouraging others to likewise return to the land in their own way. Michael is saying that we live in a very different world from the ancient pagans. It makes sense that our practice would be different too. As long as we respect the environment, most practices are okay. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think we need to be kind to ourselves. We can't save the planet on our own. We can do what we can, uh, but ultimately, we live in an entirely different world than the ancient pagans, which is why I think discussions like this and pagan happy hour is so wonderful, is because there is no rule book here. Right now, us as a community, we as modern pagans are trying to figure out what exactly that means, what our role is, and really what our spiritual mission is as modern pagans when it comes to some of these bigger, wider issues. Let's see. Sage in the comments says, I feel like today, as a modern witch, I have a responsibility to nature through communing with the earth by growing food, composting, recycling, volunteering for environmental organizations, etc. Yeah, that's definitely one way to take it, to kind of really jump in full force to taking on the responsibility for Gaia, for the planet, and helping to heal her. So I love how many thoughts you guys are having about this context and this question and this time of year, because this is really when I started thinking about plants and herbs as they are popping up, as they are growing, as every year I find the beauty in these biological processes, and not just looking at them from a scientific standpoint, but from an animistic and a spiritual standpoint as well. So, next, I thought I'd share what I'm doing this year, in case you're curious. And I'd love to hear what you guys are doing too. I thought I'd share my own kind of brief journey from City Witch to Green Witch, which is still in process. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I have lived in many cities throughout my life. Um, right after college, I lived in Japan, I lived in South Korea, I lived in Prague, and then I lived in Chicago for many years. After that, I lived in Dallas. And all of that time, my personal experience with planting and herbs was very limited, pretty much just limited to cooking. I did try and eat seasonally over those years a little bit, but it wasn't until probably 2 years ago that I really started to look at green witchcraft myself. And in part because I really do value the wheel of the year, looking at the agricultural seasons. And I understood at a certain point that if I really wanted to connect with the natural world, I had to start putting my fingers in dirt and trying to grow things myself. But this is still a very much new thing for me. But I can say that the moment I started a year ago, I am fully obsessed, which is really fun. I was living in a small apartment last year in Dallas. It did have a balcony, and that's the first time that I attempted to grow my own herbs and vegetables just in pots. And I had somewhat success, some things better than others. I grew a combination of just vegetables I could eat, some regular herbs, and some witchy herbs as well. And then in, let's see, last July is when I moved to Savannah. I did have a very small apartment where I grew a couple things on my balcony, but then in December is when I moved in here. And I do have a little bit of space for growing. You can check out my garden tour video if you're curious on that. And I have already started to set up some space for my witchy garden and for my planting. And it's been quite a journey. I'm having so much fun already. After buying this house, I knew that the first thing I wanted to start with was trees, because those take the longest to produce. So far, since I've lived here, I've only been here kind of a few months, but over the past couple months, I've bought a lemon tree, a lime tree, mandarin orange tree, and a fig tree that I've planted. So that should give me a good start. As for vegetables, I currently have tomatoes, bell peppers, jalapenos, carrots, a couple types of beets, a couple types of beans, some daikon radish, regular radish. I got a good handful of different herbs that have started to already grow pretty significantly because here in Savannah, I was able to start pretty early, which is exciting. You can kind of grow year round here depending on what you're growing. And for herbs, I love herbs. I love cooking. I love eating seasonally. I have a ton that I have started and I'm so excited about. I do need to do a garden tour update because I planted so much since we last chatted. I have basil, cilantro, chamomile. I have dill, thyme, oregano, lavender. I planted rue for more witchy contexts. And I really do plan to plant a lot of other traditional witchy herbs, such as St. John's wort and mugwort and things like that. So I have so many big plans here, and I'm still at the beginning stages. But what I can say is that I've spent the vast majority of my experience as a witch and pagan not thinking too much about the land and planting. And then for the past 2 years, thinking quite a lot about it. And I feel like I have gained so much spiritual connection from just starting to incorporate growing things, and even amidst the many failures I've had in the garden, which so far have been quite a few. I'm really enjoying the process. So I'd love, to hear from you guys what you are growing this season. Do you have plans? Whether you just have space on your windowsill, whether you have a balcony or a full giant piece of land, what are you growing this spring? What are you excited to grow? Oh, I do see we have a super chat here from Daka. Thank you so much. That says, there's nothing wrong with city witches. Someone has to turn those gray landscapes green. Yes. I felt that way in Chicago. One of my favorite things to do is like seed bombs, where you put some seeds in kind of like a clay soil mixture, and then you throw them into vacant lots. It's kind of illegal, but you won't rat me out, right? I love doing that here in Savannah too. Just like let the wildflowers bloom in all these unsightly spaces. Because I do still live in the city here, but just with a little bit more space. Oh, and I have a super chat from Wednesday. She mentions, I asked my husband to get me the Native American Herbal Bible, and that she's learned so much from it. I am in my own learning process. I am so excited to be learning about herbalism and plant lore for the first time. So by no means look at me as an expert here when it comes to green witchery. I am just started, but I hope I'm able to convey my enthusiasm for the subject through this pagan happy hour, because I'm just having the best time learning through this process. We do have a couple minutes left, and I see you all chiming in now on what you are planting this spring season. So keep it up in our last few minutes. If you did enjoy this episode, if you did find some value to it, now would be a great time to do a super chat if you are able. But let me see what you guys have to say. Let's see. I see Henry mentioning persimmon and mandarin seeds. That sounds exciting. Graves is mentioning that the sage and rosemary survived the winter, and that he plans on putting in dill and cilantro. I have a giant rosemary plant that I picked up a couple years ago during Christmas time. It was for sale as kind of almost like a mini Christmas tree, but it was rosemary, and I've kept it alive all these years, and it's in a pot right by my front entrance, as rosemary brings good luck. So I have that right by my front door. Let's see what else you guys have to say. Leah's mentioning that mint and marigolds are a garden must keep. as they keep rabbits away and bring in butterflies, and that marigolds have spiritual connections to the other realms. Yes, I did plant a bunch of marigolds around my vegetables this year. I don't have any garden beds yet. That's going to be like a stage 2 thing for my garden. So right now I just kind of put some compost in and mixed it in with the soil, but I do really hope to have eventually some beautiful garden beds that I put marigolds around. I'll have to do another garden tour update so I can show you my thoughts. Let's see. Chloe is saying, I'm just trying to keep my succulents alive. My lavender and mint is unkillable. Yes, mint is one of the best things to grow if you are new to gardening because it really is kind of unkillable. I recommend, of course, growing it in a pot because it can become invasive real quick. And another thing, you mentioned succulents in your comment. Houseplants is another fun thing I've gotten into lately. I shared my houseplant room on Instagram a little while ago, though I might make like a whole video about my houseplants. I think I have about 30 or so houseplants that I'm taking care of right now. It's been really fun. Oh, and I see some of you guys mentioning composting. Yes, I just bought this really awesome compost bin. It's got 2 chambers that you can spin. So you fill one up, and then when it's full, you start the other one. Well, that one is kind of working its magic. And then you just kind of spin them almost like a Tibetan wheel. Every time I pass the garden, I just spin it. And it's slowly creating compost for me. Kind of a different system than just kind of having a big pile of compost because I have such a small yard. I'm trying to come up with some different systems there. But yes, I have been composting for a while and I'm really enjoying it. Let's see. Sage is mentioning that it's her second year doing a raised garden bed. She's growing heirloom tomatoes, eggplants, cilantro, onions, serrano peppers, and strawberries. Yes, awesome. I actually inherited 2 blueberry bushes that are pretty scraggly looking when I bought this house, but the first blueberry has arrived and it's about to be picked. I'm very excited. I don't know if I'll get many this season. The bushes were looking pretty sad, but I'm going to really enjoy that one blueberry. Let's see. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I see Connie mentioning in the comments that she's getting carnivorous plants for her inside of her house to get the gnats. I need that because I am in a house from 1903. And yeah, you can see these windows. These windows are old. Bugs get in. So I need me some carnivorous plants. Let's see. Ooh, Erin has an interesting idea, mentioning you could water your compost in the design of a sigil. That's a neat idea. Some good sigil magic there. Let me see. Oh, and I see some of you guys mentioned you have sundews. I'm actually trying to grow one over there right now from seed. Let's see if it succeeds. But I plan on having some sundews in this house to catch some of those bugs. Oh, nice. Oh, you guys have so many good comments. I'll have to talk to you all later in the Discord community about tips for my garden because I am still new here. I'm still discovering things. The previous owner did plant some roses out in the back that I am really enjoying. They just bloomed. So it's been so fun to discover the things that she planted that are working well. And then I've also had to already tear up a bunch of what she did because there's tons of ivy that is just destroying so much. The ivy is taking over. So I've had to kill so much ivy over the past couple months, but it'll be worth it ultimately because I need more space for growing vegetables. So I really expect my own experience with seasonality and green witchery as a whole with my both witch's garden and my culinary garden to develop and grow over the years. I'm so excited for it. And I want to thank you guys so much for sharing what you guys are growing. You guys have been giving me a lot of great ideas and inspiration. I want to thank you all so much for joining me this Friday. This has been a really fun chat. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're not yet subscribed, do please consider subscribing, as I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday. And yeah, thank you again. I will, of course, see you all next week, and I want to wish you a wonderful evening. I'll talk to you later. Bye.